Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining in for today's webinar. This is Paul Reyes with CommonLook, and today we're going to talk about tagging lists and tables of contents. First of all, a little bit of housekeeping, making sure that audio is working correctly and everything. Make sure you can hear me, but you're on mute, so we can't hear you. If you are having technical issues with the Zoom platform, the webinar platform itself, please drop those questions in the chat and we will help you out the best we can. If you have questions about the content in today's presentation, please drop those questions, comments, and so on in the Q&A pod, and we will check those at the end. All right, thank you very much. And also, just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded. We will caption it, and we will send the recording captioned to you when it's available. So please give us a couple days or so to get that done, but be on the lookout for it. If you registered for today's webinar, we're going to send it to you, right? You don't even have to ask. So, but feel free if you want to. But that being said, let's jump right on into things and talk about tables of contents and lists. So here's our agenda. We're going to get into tables of contents first, simply because that's generally what you're going to see first in the document, right? You wouldn't get to a list and then the table of contents, likely. So we'll take it from the top, kind of talking about tables of contents, things to consider when it comes to creating a table of contents in your document, or perhaps adding one in Acrobat after the fact, and then certainly tagging the table of contents, making sure that it is accessible. And then we will shift gears slightly and talk about lists and how to tag lists and some things to be paying attention to and so on. As mentioned, we'll have some time at the end to entertain questions, comments, and so on. So please, again, feel free to drop those in the Q&A pod as we go. And at the end, there will also be contact information if we don't get to your question now, or if there's something that you want more follow-up with. Feel free to reach out to us and we'll provide that contact information at the end as well. So when it comes to tables of contents, first of all, standards do not require that your documents include a table of contents, right? That's entirely up to the author, the content creator, whether or not you want to include a table of contents in the document. Now, of course, for really long documents, the table of contents can be helpful, right? Can be great for navigation and so on, but they're not required by the standards, right? During remediation, having a table of contents in the document can actually be helpful for the remediator because it can often help to answer questions of, which heading level should I use for this particular section of the document or this particular text, if it's a major section or if it's a subsection and so on. Sometimes you can check back to the table of contents and see, should this be a heading level 3 or a heading level 4, depending on where things are hierarchically and so on. So can be a little bit helpful, but again, not required. And of course, as I mentioned, very helpful for navigating and using PDFs, especially if they're really, really long, right? Now, that being said, that they're not required, if there is a table of contents in the document, it's furthermore not required that the table of contents is linked, right? So you can either provide one or not. You can either link it or not, right? You could just provide basically a list of the sections in your document, what page they start on, and so on. It's not required that it's linked. However, if it is linked, then there are functional things to consider before you get into the actual PDF remediating. And of course, the tagging of a linked table of contents introduces a couple of other things or a couple additional things to think about while you're tagging it. From a functional standpoint, if you're going to include a table of contents in your document, and if it's going to be linked, then of course you want to make sure that if someone was to follow the link, whether you're clicking on something in the table of contents or however you're following the links, you want to make sure that of course the link takes you to the correct page, right? So if something says that this section begins on page 10 and it's linked, then that link ought to take you to page 10. right? So that's kind of the functional part of it. And then we'll get into the tagging here in just a second. So the correct construction, I'm going to talk about it and then we'll again show it in just a bit here. The correct construction for a table of contents is you have your TOC, right, your table of contents tag, which contains inside it TOCIs, or table of content items, right, which then contain reference tags for the content that's in the line of the table of contents, and potentially a link tag if the table of contents is linked, and then links would contain, the link tags then would contain the text for the line in the table of contents and the annotation, or you'll see that in Acrobat as the object reference, the OBJR. That's the actual clickable part of the link in the table of contents. So that's just kind of a quick overview of the construction, and of course nested table of contents. We'll get into how those are put together and where does the nested table of contents go and so on as well. And then another thing that often comes up is, what do we do with the leaders? Are the leaders going to be read? So the leaders are the dots, for example, between introduction, and then there's a whole bunch of dots, and then whatever page the introduction is on. We want to have those not tagged, right? Untagged or artifacted, artifact containers, so that a screen reader is not reading the text and then saying all of the dots, or depending on which screen reader you're using, it might indicate that there's just X number of dots, right? Sometimes when I listen to a table of contents, I'll hear the text and then 91 dots and then the page number, and that 91 dots, that's all the leaders, the dot leaders going across the page. So we will we'll get into PDF here and check out how to tag a table of contents and how to clean up some of these things that maybe we need to address. All right, so I'm going to just quickly change gears here. We're going to check it out now. So I'll go to my desktop and we will bring open the table of contents PDF and get down to work. Now this one is not tagged right now. So first I get the little message there from Acrobat about how do we want to handle this untagged PDF. But first things first, I'm going to go over to the tag tree in Acrobat where it says no tags available, and I'm just going to have Acrobat tag this for me. So add tags to document. So there we go. There's my tags. Now, of course, we know that when it comes to auto tagging, no matter how you're going about it, you're going to want to check to make sure that it was done correctly and everything's been addressed and so on. So for example, we have a part tag, which may or may not be okay, and then we have an H2 for TOCs in Word, which I'm going to pretend that's the title of my document, and then paragraph tag, which when I select it, it's not only got the sentence about what we're doing here with styles and so on, but then it actually has part of the table of contents. So clearly this hasn't been tagged correctly, and I would need to fix it up. Now I'm going to go ahead and go over to the accessibility pane in Acrobat and do a quick check, just run the accessibility check to see. But before I do that, seeing as we're focusing on lists and in this document tables of contents, if I was going to manually tag this in Acrobat, for example, if I open up the reading order tool where I'm able to then manually tag things, I'm going to notice that in that tool there's no buttons for TOC or TOCI, right? So I could tag this table of contents in Acrobat, but it would be a lot of work. I'd have to create a bunch of tags and then convert those tags and assemble my table of contents and so on. I'm going to run my accessibility check. Now, granted, I would expect some failures to happen or manually anyway. So when it says the document has two issues, one is to manually check the logical reading order, right? But also, you want to make sure you're checking the tags, because as we noticed, we didn't even have a table of contents tag in the tag tree. We're obviously always going to be asked to check contrast and so on as well. And there's an issue with heading levels, right? So with inappropriate nesting, because basically we don't start with an H1, right? So the title, TOCs in Word, right? So, but one could think that with a quick auto tag from Acrobat and then running the accessibility checker, it might not look like this document is in as bad a shape as it is, right? But we don't have a table of contents taken care of. This one actually is linked. If I was to click on the items in the table of contents, it would take me to the correct page. Now, of course, I put that in air quotes, even though we're on a webinar. It's just a little one-page document, so it's all going to take me to just page one, but we're going to get the idea for how to tag a table of contents anyways. So again, excuse me, if I was going to take care of this in Acrobat, I would have to fix up this table of contents manually, creating a bunch of tags and converting them, and then how to deal with the dot leaders and so on, so that they don't end up getting read. And in fact, if we go into the tag tree and we notice, for example, selecting the paragraph tag, there's a link, but then I can see in the tag pane that chapter 3, section A, and then the dots are all there as well. So a screen reader would end up reading those dots, right? Which we wouldn't want to hear if we were using screen readers. So I'm going to save my work, right? Because I've added tags and changed things and so on. And then I'm going to open up Common Look and take care of this the rest of the way there. So navigating up to plugins in Acrobat, and then Common Look, and then Common Look PDF. I'm going to go ahead and open up the software and see how we do. So Common Look's opening, and as we've noticed in some other webinars that we've done in the past, our workflow in Common Look is to navigate through the tags first, checking tag types and fixing things and so on as we go, and then run a verification to see if there's anything that we missed. One thing that I noticed right from the start is the H2 TOCs in Word. I just want that to be a heading 1. So I'm using some keyboard shortcuts here and so on to convert that to a heading 1, right, for my document. Also, I don't really need this part tag here. So I'm going to get that out of the way and just flatten my tag so that everything's out at the root level. So there's my H1 now for the title of my document, and then this paragraph tag, which isn't quite right because it contains part of the table of contents. So to tag this in Common Look, I'm just going to select the table of contents, navigate up to generate tag from selection, and hit TOC. Now we've covered, I think in some of the other webinars that we've done recently, things like level up. So I'm pushing that TOC out of the tag that it got nested inside of, doing a quick little cleanup to get rid of the empty tags that were left behind while putting together the table of contents. So here's my TOC, right, my table of contents tag with my TOCIs, table of content items inside. Now, in looking at my TOCIs, there's 4 of them at this level in the tag tree, but my table of contents is longer than 4 items. But at the root level, at the main level, if you will, chapter 1, 2, 3, and chapter 4, right? So those are why I have the 4 TOCIs at the first level. And then when we get to chapter 3, there's section A and section B inside. And so when I get to the 3rd TOCI, I see that there's a nested table of contents as well. Right now, one thing that's important to note, just like in Acrobat when we tag this, as I select the TOC or any of those TOCIs, the dots are tagged. Right now, as we mentioned, we don't want a screen reader to read those dots. So I'm just going to go to my context menu and choose Artifact Leaders. And what that does is it untags the dots. So now my first TOCI, I have a reference tag inside, and then we have a link tag. And then inside the link tag is the annotation. That's the clickable part, right? That would take me to page 1 in this case. And then the text for chapter 1, let's start here, right? So there's the link tag. And you'll notice also that Common Look automatically puts the alternative text on the link tag for that link. So chapter 1, let's start here, right? So there's the first reference in the first TOCI. Going down to my second TOCI, I'm just going to use arrow keys on my keyboard now. There's, again, my reference with the link tag and the annotation and the text inside. So that's been tagged up correctly now. And then the third one, chapter 3, right? We're making great progress. Here's the reference tag for that with, again, the link, the annotation, and the text inside. So we're good to go there. And then our nested table of contents, which when we open it up, we can see that there's the TOCI for chapter 3, section A, again with the reference and the link and so on. And then the TOCI for section B with all of its parts, the reference and the link tag with the annotations and the text as well. So the nested table of contents has been taken care of as well. And then our last item, table of contents item, there's the reference and again the link tag, the annotation, and the text for chapter 4. So there's our table of contents put together correctly. So again, I'm just going to go up to the first table of contents item. We have our TOC. TOCI is the first child inside TOC. And then inside the TOCI, we have the reference tag. Now, if our table of contents was not linked, we would have inside the reference tag, we would have just the text for that line. So chapter 1, let's start here, and then the page number. But because it is linked, we have a link tag with the annotation. Again, that's the OBJR, the object reference in Acrobat, and then the text that corresponds with that link, right? So there's your proper TOC structure, right? And then, of course, in a real-world scenario, we would continue on remediating through the document, but there's basically just text here so that we could have the TOCs go to their corresponding headings and so on, right? So hopefully that helps with understanding how to address table of contents. Again, not only with the structure, but where nested table of contents go inside the TOCI that it's a child of, right? So the TOCI, and then, but the nested table of contents does not go, for example, inside the reference tag, right? So sometimes people get confused about where does the nested TOC go? Not inside the reference, just as a sibling to it within the TOCI, right? So there we go. I see some things are popping up in the Q&A pod. I'm gonna put those on hold for just a bit. And then we're going to check out some lists, and then we can come back to our table of contents as needed. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save and close here, and that'll take me back to our presentation. So a little bit on TOC. So let's change gears and talk about lists, right? So lists and table of contents are very similar in their construction, where we had TOC and then TOCI. For lists, we're going to have L and then LI, right? List and then list item. Here's where lists and table of contents differ then, is that inside a TOCI, you're going to have your reference and possibly link tags and so on. In a list, you're going to have your list items and then your labels and the L bodies. The label will be for things like numbers, letters in an ordered list, bullets in an unordered list, right? And then your L body contains the text of the actual list item itself, right? Excuse me. Another question that often comes up is, what about nested lists? Where do they go? So we touched on where nested tables of contents go, inside the TOCI tag, but not inside the reference. We're going to check out nested lists and where those go. Spoiler alert, the nested list goes inside kind of its parent L body for the content that is pointing to then the related content that makes up the nested list. Oftentimes the question comes up, do I need label tags? Right now, there's no rule that says every list shall have labels. So if your list doesn't have labels, then no, you would not have label tags, right? However, from an authoring perspective, it would be very, very helpful to create your lists with labels, whether they're numbers, letters, bullets, other symbols or whatever, so that visually somebody knows where one item starts and the next item, one item stops, the next item starts, and so on. So visually, those bullets and so on can be helpful. When your visual list includes labels, then you definitely need to use the label tag. No, it's not okay to put, for example, your bullets just inside the L body, right? For a couple of reasons, actually. First, the standards, PDF accessibility standards require that the most semantically appropriate tag is used for the content. And so when it comes to bullets and other, ordered list indications, that would be the label for the list. So it would go inside a label tag, being the most semantically appropriate tag for that content. Also, the label tag works in conjunction with the list numbering value, which is assigned to the list tag. And the list numbering value, working with the labels, is how screen readers and other assistive technologies know how to handle the labels. And for example, in a Roman numeral list, to indicate that it's, the items are Roman 1, Roman 2, Roman 3, instead of I, and so on through the list, right? So for that reason, in an ordered list in particular, the list numbering value as well as the label tags, very, very important. Another thing to consider, kind of going back to your table of contents concept, right? If you're looking through the document and the headings are numbered, you want to still tag those as headings as opposed to tagging all of the headings in a list. And then, somebody who's listening to a really long document is told that there's a really long list there, and all of the structure, after the title is just list items and so on. That wouldn't really be semantically appropriate. Definitely not the most accurate way to convey your information, most likely, right? So if something is supposed to be a heading, even if it's numbered, right, don't tag it as a list. So just some things to kind of keep in mind as we go. And again, we're going to open up a PDF and check out some list tagging. So again, go to my desktop here, grab the second document for lists, and away we go. Again, this is not tagged already. So first of all, I'm going to go over to Acrobat and just have Acrobat tag it. Now, when I do that, we see the part tag, and there's an H2, again, which I would want that to be an H1 for the title of my document. And then there's a paragraph, and then another paragraph, and then we see two list tags. So it kind of got some of the lists, but not quite correct. So I would obviously need to fix that up. But interestingly enough, because it actually did tag some of the lists, right, or tag some of the list, because really this is only one list. But let's see how it did. So we'll again run the accessibility check and see, what Acrobat notices that it did or didn't do correctly. So the document, at the document level, 2 issues. Again, we're always going to be asked to verify that the reading order is correct, and the tag type, right, which we noticed there's a paragraph for the first item in our list, raindrops on flowers. So certainly we would need to fix up this list. And then of course, we're also always going to be asked to check color and contrast and so on as well. Those are our 2 manual checks that Acrobat is going to have us always do. And then interestingly, there's the appropriate nesting for headings. And again, element 1, that's the heading here at the top for list. But in the list section of my checking, it says that list items have passed and labels and L bodies have passed, right? So I could, if I didn't know any better, I could think that Acrobat has tagged my lists correctly, right? However, if I open up the tag tree and check out these lists further, so the first list tag, ignoring for a second that the list really should include items 1 through 5 and the nested list. So my first list begins with the nested list underneath number 1. But ignoring that for just a second and looking at just the list itself, we have the list tag, we have the list items with the label and the L body for each of these flowers, right? Tulips for letter B here, and then letter C in hydrangeas. So that list is tagged correctly, even though grand scheme of things, it's not all put together correctly. But in the second list, which contains everything else that should have been in the main list, if you will, when I open up the list tag, I see 2 list items, and then I see 2 lists, 2 list tags, immediately as children to the main list tag. Now, you're not actually allowed to do this by PDF specification. You can either have your nested list inside the L body, or you can have it at the root level. So in this case, it'd be under this part tag. But you can't have a list as a child to just another list tag, right? So even though it was auto tagged, it was not exactly done correctly, right? So when I go back to the item for number 2, again, here's the label and the L body, so that's fine. I'm going to check out the third one here. The label and the L body are again fine, but then we have our nested list now for 4, and then its sublist of A, B, and C, but it's been tagged as a separate list, and then we have one list item for 4 and warm mittens, and then another nested list. So if somebody's using a screen reader, they're going to be told there's a whole bunch of lists where there's really only a couple, right? There's one item and then a nested list. So structurally, we're going to be getting some inaccurate relationships and structural information provided to us. And then when we go down to number 5, we have the same kind of situation where there's the list item for 5 and then another nested list for A, B, and C for the types of string or things that can tie up brown paper packages, right? So clearly this wasn't done ideally, even though, again, the Acrobat check didn't throw any issues at us for our lists, right? So this is why it's important to really know how properly tagged lists are put together and so on. So again, I'm going to save that. Just it's a good idea to save your work from time to time, right? And then I'll go ahead and open up Common Look as soon as it's done saving. So go to Plugins, choose Common Look, and then again, Common Look PDF. So when it comes to tagging this list, I'm going to treat this very similarly to how I did my table of contents. I'm going to open up my tag tree. And again, I'm going to flatten the tags because I don't need that part tag there. And then I'm just going to convert my H2 to an H1 because that's the title of my document. So then we have the paragraph. For these are a few of my favorite things. And then really what's left on this page is just the list. So I'm going to highlight what should be in a list. And then again, go up to generate tag from selection and hit the button for list. And then of course, I'm going to push some tags around, clean up the empties that get left behind and so on. So clean up my empty tags and then I can verify that my list was put together correctly. So here's the list tag. It's got everything in it that I just highlighted. And then we have 5 list items at the kind of the first level in from the list tag, right? Also, by the way, when I select that list tag, I can navigate over to the properties panel and scroll down and check my list numbering value. So it's been set to decimal because this is a numbered list, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? When I go to the first list item for number 1, raindrops on flowers, and it has a nested list, I'm going to go ahead and open up my list item. The label has number 1, and then the L body. When I open that up, I see the text for raindrops on flowers, and then my nested list. And when I'll open that up, I see the 3 list items for the 3 flower types as well. Selecting my nested list, A, B, and C. Again, going over to my properties panel, checking the list numbering is set to lower alpha. So that's taken care of for me automatically as well. So that's pretty nice. And again, we can open up the list items. I'm just going to get my mouse out of the way and use the arrow keys. So there's the label and the L body for each of the items in the nested list. So go ahead in the left arrow on my keyboard to close those tags and go down to the second one. Open it up. There's the label for number 2 and then the L body for number 2. Now I don't necessarily have to open that L body because there's no nested list inside it that I need to verify. So that's fine there. And then I can go down to the third one, very similarly, label and L body. Again, no nested list inside it, as I would expect. Fourth one, I have my label for number 4 and the L body. And again, when I open it up, we have the text for the, kind of the parent text, if you will, and then the nested list with the 3 list items for the types of mittens, right? So with the labels and the L bodies as expected. And then going down to the 5th one, again, we have our list item and then the label for number 5 and then the L body for brown paper packages, and then our nested list with various tying types of, right, twine, yarn, and rope. So there's our list items with our labels and our L bodies. So there we go. And again, to just review the structure, you have your list tag with your list items inside containing labels and L bodies. And then with a nested list, the nested list goes inside the L body, the content that it's related to. So hopefully that helps. Obviously, in a real world scenario, we would want to run our verification, you know, and make sure that everything is good. So in fact, I'll go ahead and create my document tag, right? And then I can go ahead and run my verification. So we're going to check structurally to make sure that everything is put together correctly. And we'll also test against WCAG 2.1 AA. Right? So when we run our check, and then the results panel opens up, tells me how the results happen or what the status is for every single checkpoint in both standards. So don't worry about this when you get a big table that opens, but if I filter out just to see what failed, nothing, good for me, right? And then what do I need to manually verify? And then what warnings do I have? Just like in Acrobat, we're going to be asked to make sure that color isn't the only way that information is being conveyed. So we're good on that front. The contrast ratio is appropriate on this document, so we don't have any issues there as well. A couple of metadata questions asking me to verify the title, tagging lists is appropriate, which it is, and also that the language, English, is appropriate for the document, and it is, so I can mark those as passed. And then there's one more. It's kind of an interestingly worded checkpoint, but basically it's just saying we didn't use header or footer pagination artifacts, which in this document there aren't any, so I can just change that to not applicable and say okay. So we really have taken care of all of our results, taken care of all of our things that we needed to manually verify. Also to point out, again, that in the standards panel, when we chose our standards, the list of options there, Acrobat does not actually test against ISO 32000, and it doesn't actually test against any of the accessibility standards as well. So it's possible, as kind of showed earlier in today's webinar, it's possible to pass things in Acrobat where you still actually have failures from a tagging and accessibility standpoint. So hopefully this is helpful. I know this is kind of a lot of information in a relatively short period of time, but hopefully help to answer things like how do you tag table of contents and lists, and what's the proper structure, and especially, for example, where the nested ones go and stuff like that. So I'm going to go ahead and just switch back to our PowerPoint, open up for questions, and I'm going to check the Q&A pod here just a second. But as a reminder, we are recording this webinar. It'll be captioned and we'll send it out to you. If you've enjoyed this webinar, or even if you haven't, but you want to check out others, you can go to our website and check out the calendar for when we have other webinars coming up. We've got a lot going on this spring. The URL, https://commonlook.com/spring-2020-webinar-series. All right, check out our calendar, see what webinars you want to attend in the future. If you have any questions, comments, anything we don't get to in today's time, feel free to reach out to us at sales@commonlook.com, and we will follow up with you. And with that, I'll go ahead and check the Q&A pod. There's a bunch of things in there. So I'll just take them from the top, and hopefully we'll get your questions answered in the time that we have left. So the first question here, dot leaders sometimes separate from the page number when formatting the index. Is there a way to prevent this from happening? This, I think, if I'm reading the question correctly, this is more of an authoring question for, how this is getting done while you're creating your table of contents, for example. So that answer is going to unfortunately depend on which software you're using to author it. Of course, as I mentioned, when it comes to tagging your table of contents, you want to artifact or untag those dot leaders anyways, so that a screen reader, for example, isn't reading them, right? So however they get formatted in there, you might have to change some spacing or something like that, but we want to make sure that they're untagged in the PDF. In an unordered list, often the default character for the second tier is a dash or hyphen. My understanding is the punctuation is not necessarily announced by a screen reader. As a punctuation character, will be announced in a list context. And does it matter if it isn't announced? That's a really good question. So when it comes to list numbering, right, which really kind of drives how assistive technologies are supposed to announce or not announce bullets and other labels in a list, right? For dashes or hyphens, you would actually set the list numbering value to none. In an unordered list, your options are circle, square, and disk, or none. So if it's something that's not a circle, a square, or a disk, then you would set your list numbering value to none. And basically what it comes down to is having, making sure that it's tagged correctly, the list numbering value is set correctly, and then really that's our job from a PDF accessibility and remediation standpoint. How that gets handled the rest of the way really is up to screen reader developers and what they, how they determine that a screen reader should handle things like dashes and hyphens and stuff like that. So our job, again, is just to make sure that they're tagged correctly and that the list numbering values are set correctly. And then how AT handles that is up to those developers. Unfortunately, of course, it doesn't say in the PDF accessibility standards, for example, how a screen reader should read the dash or the hyphen. But generally, as an kind of a blanket statement, it's up to context and so on. Screen reading development people have to make those decisions for, when, for example, are periods read? Certainly not at the end of every sentence, but in a URL, in numbers where you've got, the decimal point, for example. So that's kind of up to the AT, or the assistive technology developers. Where was the context menu? I missed it. Maybe can you follow up with which context menu? Be a little bit more specific. In Common Look, you can select a tag or select anything, and then right-click on it, or use the context menu key on your keyboard to open up context menus. More kind of a general statement. Continuing on, do we need the reference tag? Yes, you do. Right, for a table of contents, you've got TOC, TOCI, and then reference, and then whether or not the table of contents is linked determines whether or not you have a link tag. But yes, you need the reference tag. The reference tag is used for kind of internal links to to someplace else in the same document, as opposed to like a URL. The link tag points externally. So hopefully that helped. How did he get rid of the dot leaders? In Common Look, chose the TOC artifact leaders, right? How come the subsections in Chapter 3 go back to a TOC rather than a TOCI? Because it's a nested table of contents, just like a nested list is tagged in a list tag, but then inside that nested TOC, we had the TOCIs and so on. So hopefully that helps. I ran online into articles that mention that a label can be used inside other tags, not just LI. That is true. However, when I try to do it, example H2 on a large document with a Roman number, Common Look tells me there's a problem with the use of label outside of the list context. Well, okay. You can have labels in other tags besides list items. However, there are rules like that a label can't go inside an H2. So could be maybe the wording of our message maybe we want to look at. Hopefully that helped. And again, if you want to ask us more questions or follow-up questions, or have us take a look at your document, for example, then you can send it on over to sales@commonlook.com. Be happy to check things out. But and the standard is changing too, by the way, the PDF standard, so that in the future, labels will be used in other places where labels aren't being used right now. So depending on what you're reading, you may have found some of that information as well. Common Look PDF right now is still testing against the the PDF version 1 and PDF UA version 1, which are the standards that are out and supported and all that stuff. There's a lot of talk about PDF and PDF UA 2, which we are very heavily involved in the development of those standards, but they're not really out and supported by various PDF platforms, assisted technology, and so on. So that's why we're still testing against PDF and PDF UA 1 at this point. When I use list numbering value of circle for an indented list, CommonLook generates a warning suggesting to use lower alpha. Is that something CommonLook plans to update so that warning doesn't come up? No, what's happening there is that CommonLook is trying to look at the characters for your indented list, and it thinks maybe that the character is a letter, and so it's suggesting, hey, basically this is just asking, are you sure that circle is more appropriate than lower alpha? Right? Because maybe it sees that character as a lowercase letter. Now, the reason that could be seeing it that way could be due to the font encoding and the character encoding and stuff like that. So this isn't actually a problem, right? This isn't something that we're actually going to keep that warning, because this is us asking you to make sure that circle really is correct. If circle's correct, then you can pass it and say, yep, it's good. And if it's not, you can thank CommonLook for throwing that at you and saying, hey, thank you for making me verify that, yeah, circle wasn't correct and I should have used something else. What is the proper way to insert a paragraph that is included in a list? So the paragraph would go inside the L body, right? So the L body would contain all of the stuff, and then sure, if you have paragraphs, or you can, nested list or whatever you have inside your list would go inside the proper tags inside the L body. Okay, can I have P tags inside the L body? Refer to my previous answer. Yes. Please explain inside LI text versus P. I think I kind of did, but it depends on what's going on in your L body. You can have the L body and then just the text, or you can have the paragraph tag containing the text inside the L body as well. And again, as mentioned, you can have other tags inside your L body too, as long as they're semantically appropriate. So hopefully that helped. If not, please drop a clarification into the QA, or drop us a note at sales@commonlook.com. If there's not a specific label, bullet, number, letter, can the LI contain just an L body? Yes. So if there really is not a label for the list item, then yes, you wouldn't use a label, and the LI would contain just the L body with the text. But if there's anything visually that indicates that it's the beginning of a list item, then you would want to include label tags. For example, the slide that I'm showing on the screen right now, right? There's basically a paragraph of text, and then there's the URL for our to our website for the webinar series calendar, and then for additional information, contact us at sales, right? So if we were to view that as a list, then this would be an example of when you would not use labels in your list. But for some of the other slides that had bullets in front of the items, then you would certainly need to use label tags. All right, so that's that one. How do you handle a situation where you have a paragraph in the middle of a list, paragraph tag inside your L body? List item 1, item 2, then some other info in a paragraph not related to the list, then list item 3. Basically, we have to tag it the way that we have to tag it. And unfortunately, in the current PDF standard, the list, if you break the list, so you have 2 items and then a paragraph of unrelated stuff, and then item 3, somebody using a screen reader is going to hear list of 2 items, and then they're going to hear out of list, and then the paragraph that's not related, and then list of however many items, starting with item 3, right? And that's the way it is right now. If that paragraph is really not related to item 2, for example, that you might want to consider from the authoring phase, why are you sticking a paragraph of unrelated content in the middle of a list of related things, right? Or from a remediator standpoint, you might have to answer the question then, is item 3 really related to the lists of 1 and 2 up above, right? So sometimes you have to make these questions and so on, or make these determinations and so on. Now, that being said, in version 2 of the PDF standard, this is being addressed so that if you, poor authoring and all, if you have a paragraph of text that's unrelated to the list surrounding it on both sides, then there is a way to tag that and indicate that this list is going to pause for a second while we read you this paragraph, and then we're going to continue the list. But that's not really out and supported at this point. How do you capture all of a list that spans several pages? One list tag contains all of the list items, regardless of whether or not it goes across a page break. Just like a table of contents, anything, a paragraph that spans multiple pages, right? You just tag that text in the paragraph, and there you go. Same for a list then. Are the periods after the number or letter in a numbered list included with the letter or number in the label tag? Yes, you don't need to really overthink that. Just grab the letter and its period, put it in a label, sure. I've noticed that JAWS often tries to read Roman numerals in a list incorrectly, etc. Even when I assign them as label tags. Which setting did you mention? You want to make sure that your list numbering value is set to Roman numerals as well. And you can have upper or lower Roman, right, for capital Roman numerals or lowercase Roman numerals. So you would want to make sure that your list numbering value is set correctly. Part 2 to my question on periods in a list, can you show the tags and text in the tag panel? So if I go back to my list document, to the tag tree, can you show the tags and the text in the tag panel? So here's the list tag with the list items, and then the label, and then the L body, for example. There's number 1, and then there's the nested list as well. But hopefully that helps. All right. Go back to our contact information for those of you who need it, and feel free to reach out to us, right? sales@commonlook.com. How would you handle a list that is interrupted by a header? Good question. I would have the header and then list of 2 items, and then the header, and then in your example that you typed into the QA pod where it goes header 1, 2, header 3, 4, I would tag that as 2 separate lists with the appropriate heading 1, heading 2, whatever it might be in between. So hopefully that helped. In regards to list numbering, are one with a period, 1 parentheses, 1 surrounded by parentheses, all decimal? Yes, if it's a number, you want to set it to decimal. And is a bullet a disc or a circle? Good question. Really, it can be either, but I would set a bullet as a disc. Has the webinar from last week's tables been posted yet? Please drop that note into the chat, because Susan is there and she would be able to answer that, I think. Or again, shoot us an email to sales@commonlook.com. And I don't think it's that we're posting them. I think it's that we're sending them out. So if you didn't get it, maybe check your junk email folder too and see if things go there. Right? You might look into that as well. The context menu question related to when you artifacted the dot leaders. So to open the context menu in CommonLook, you select something, whether it's a tag or text, whatever, depends on what you're trying to do. You can select the TOC tag, for example, right-click on it, use the context menu key on your keyboard, and we'll open up your context menu, and then you get it from there. So I understand that TOC does not have to be linked. Do references have to be linked? No, they do not. When I went into user verification and chose passed, it didn't hold. The next time I opened the document, it had the same verification list. Yes, that's because that's the default in CommonLook. We don't save verification data from session to session. So if you close CommonLook, it's not going to save anything that by default is going to come up as user verification is going to do that every time you run a new check, right? Just like in Acrobat, right? If I was to run the full check in Acrobat, I'm asked to check the reading order and color and contrast. If I pass those things, I close that PDF, I open it up again in Acrobat, I run the full check, I'm going to be asked to verify those things again. Similar behavior in CommonLook. That's why you want to make sure that you're generating your compliance report before you're done and you finally close out. Should a reference list be tagged as a list or just as P, just as paragraph. So I'm picturing here in my mind where in the document it says references and then like a bibliography, for example. Unless there's something that indicates that it's a list, right, like labels, you would tag it as paragraphs, right? But I might need to see more specifically what you're talking about if that didn't help. If a list is using images for the bullets, should you just leave off the label tag, just have the L body containing the list item text? No, that's a really great question. So if the bullets in your list are actually images, then in the current PDF standard, images that convey important information, that would be the bullets for the beginning of your list items, they need to go inside figure tags, and they need alternative text. So probably the alternative text might be bullet, for example. But because they are list labels, those figure tags would go inside labels. So your list tag would contain list items. The label would contain a figure tag with alternative text that says bullet, for example. And then the L body would have the text for the list. Again, we're using the most semantically appropriate tag for the content, and all content that conveys important information, like where a list item begins, would need to be tagged. If numbering is used but not for list purposes, i.e. outline format, and those numbers are not headers, would I just tag those numberings as paragraph tags? I'm trying to picture your scenario. If numbering is used but not for like headings, and those numbers are not headers, okay, so not like headings, would I just tag those numberings as paragraph tags? I'd really like to see that, because unless you can provide more follow-up information in the Q&A pod, but we're running short on time. I'm having a hard time picturing that scenario actually where something is numbered but not headers. I might ask the question, well, is this, are these subheaders maybe H3s or H4s further down in the section, for example? So sorry, I just would like a little bit more context. Scenario, there are multiple lists across various columns with some overflow from one column to the next. How would these be handled? If it's one list that spans multiple columns, you would tag it up as one list, just like if you had a list that spanned multiple pages, right? You would tag it the exact same way. Where in Acrobat would I find the list numbering values? Great question. Long story short, very, very well hidden, right? Yeah, you really got to dig into the guts of the PDF to find the list numbering value in Acrobat itself. Can you show again how to clean up the empty tags? Really quickly, it's from a context menu in Common Look. I can right-click on any tag and then navigate to clean up and go from there. All right, so that's how you do that. And it looks like right down below the wire on the last one, how do you incorporate icons or images as bullets? And I mentioned that just briefly before. You would put the icons or the images in figure tags, give them the alternative text of bullet, for example, and then those figure tags would all go inside their label tags above their L body, right inside the list item where they need to go. So those are some great questions, lots of great participation today. Like I said before, the webinar is being recorded. We'll get it captioned, we'll get it sent out to you. If we didn't get to your question today, or it looks like I got through all of the questions in the Q&A pod, but if you think of a question after the fact and you would like some information or clarification, maybe something that we briefly discussed today, feel free to reach out to us at sales@commonlook.com, and remember that we are here for you. So thanks for tuning in. Stay happy, stay healthy, stay safe, and happy remediating. Take care, everybody.